Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Hourglass election special webinar. We're delighted to have so many people join us this afternoon. So we have our expert panel with us. We'll introduce in just a moment. We are today going to be discussing the Hourglass Oath campaign, Older Age, Tomorrow's Hope. And if you haven't already signed up, we will put the link in the chat and we'd ask you all to take that pledge. We'll also be discussing the Hourglass Manifesto, which has been produced in advance of the election. Again, we'll put a link to that into the chat for people to download. We will also then finally issue an evaluation survey immediately after this afternoon's webinar, and would really appreciate it if people could take the time to just give us your feedback. It helps us improve all the time. So we'll start with our introductions, and Richard, will come to you first. Richard, you're on mute.
I am muted. There was a rather loud noise outside. I'm Richard. I'm the Chief Exec of Hourglass. I've been with the organisation. This is my 6th year now. And I will hand over to Nick.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nick Kelly. I'm the External Affairs and Parliamentary Manager at Hourglass. I've been with the charity 2 years, and I do a lot of the lobbying work, working with MPs and other politicians throughout the United Kingdom.
And Seth.
Hello, I'm Seth Tibble. I'm an academic and journalist with expertise in public affairs, and I was brought in to compile the upcoming report on party manifestos, looking at policy.
And I'm Veronica Gray, Deputy CEO and Director of Policy, and I've been with the charity just over 9 years, but have spent my entire working career in the abuse sector. So we've had a number of questions submitted in advance of this afternoon's webinar, but before we go, and we will invite questions from our attendees this afternoon as well into the chat function. We'll keep an eye on that as we go. But Richard, do you want to start us off with an overview of the charity and the importance of having government policies which recognise the abuse of older people?
So for anybody who has accidentally joined this webinar, I will explain what the charity does. We are the only charity, UK-wide charity, that focuses on the abuse of older people, 60 plus. We have a 24/7 helpline. We do undertake casework service as well as the policy units work, which involves research. And we also have a knowledge bank and an instant message service. Our work has grown considerably over the last 4 or 5 years, from probably impacting around the lives of around 4,500 people back in 2017-18. And nowadays we work with around coming up to 50,000 people now. So, and that's a really good way to illustrate why we'd like to see more specialist policies around ensuring the safety, the independence, free from abuse and harm of older people. And it's a shocking indictment, really, to where we are in society, where, and I'm not going to go through the manifestos at this moment in time, but it's a shocking indictment of where we are as a society where we know that 2.5 million people are affected by the abuse of older people every year. And yet, there is scant reference to this within manifestos or prior to the election within the policies of the 4 administrations in the United Kingdom, the 4 nations. So we've worked really hard over the last 5 years and before to lobby, to highlight the growing epidemic of the abuse of older people with ministers and department officials in Westminster, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And we hope to see a significant improvement in the steps that they are making to grow that policy area. And likewise in Scotland, where we've really struggled to get data and understanding of the implications of that abuse, ongoing abuse. So Veronica mentioned at the start that we've launched this oath campaign, which is Older Age, Tomorrow's Hope. But actually, there's a much more simplistic message that runs alongside Oath, which is that we need to create a safer aging society by 2050. 25 years of work to ensure that the next generation, the generation after, and the generation after that do not have to deal with an epidemic of abuse that we're facing at the moment, and that violence against older people is as socially unacceptable as all other forms of abuse at the moment. And you're going to hear a lot in the webinar around violence against women and girls. And you're also going to hear lots of references to political parties. And just to put on record before we start in earnest, that we are absolutely 100% behind all of the efforts that are being made to tackle violence against women and girls. We do believe that the vast majority of abuse is gendered. And so therefore we work with our compatriots across all forms of abuse to end abuse, but we are here to support older victim survivors. And lastly, before I hand over to Veronica to talk through some of the questions we've had, it's also worth saying that we are a politically neutral organisation. So whilst we may give you some indicators of which manifestos have really shone in terms of their priorities around abuse and around creating an independent and safer aging society, we curry no favour whatsoever to any political party, and we work with all political parties across the 4 nations. So that's probably a good moment to hand back to Veronica.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'm going to hand over to Nick and Seth now to talk us through the independent research that Seth has undertaken on behalf of Hourglass and what we have discovered. So, Nick, do you just want to lead us into how we came about, how this came about based on our own charity manifesto?
Yeah, so many of you probably attended our webinar a couple of weeks ago. We launched our manifesto, and that was really the sort of key things that we think can be achieved in the next parliamentary term in Westminster, but actually also the terms in the 4 nations. So we did specific calls for Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And actually there were a lot of consistent themes. So for example, things like having a strategy, having policy and legislation in place that is enforced, having specialist support available, having some of these key things that basically recognize that older people who have faced abuse need specific support. And we need governments, and we need all parties actually who are represented in corridors of power to be aware of this and to be actively advocating for it. So we really said a couple of weeks ago. Of course, then we've now had the party manifestos coming out, and they were coming out as late as last Friday. And I think we've heard already there is a level of disappointment, although there is definitely some movement. And I think if we also apply sort of over the last few years, we've had increased engagement, particularly at a government level. I mean, we've met with ministers in Wales and in Westminster, and we're meeting fairly senior politicians from Stormont and Northern Ireland. It would really be only Scotland where we haven't met anyone from government recently. And even in Scotland, we've met with SMPs in the last few years. So the engagement's growing, and I think that's starting to creep through, but we're not there yet. And this is reflected in this latest analysis of the manifestos. So I'll probably pass over to Seth to talk a bit about the specifics of how we did this assessment, but that's where we were coming from.
Yeah, happy to take over on this. I mean, the way this has been done, firstly, there's been an assessment criteria that's entirely based around the Hourglass manifesto, and that's actually been devised by Hourglass. I've had no input in that whatsoever. And separately, I have entirely independently tried to assess that against all the party manifestos. I've looked at about a little more than a dozen in total. Supporting that, if you were to take the total possible number of marks, and I should just say that the way this works briefly is if they actually do completely preemptively meet some of the demands of the Hourglass manifesto, they get 1 mark for that. Otherwise, if they show some synergy in that direction, some sort of fellow traveller thoughts, as it were, they get half a mark, or otherwise no marks at all if it's not mentioned at all. The maximum possible number of marks that a party could get on this across the board would be 38, and very much in support of what Richard and Nick have said, the maximum marks actually given out of 38 is 11. The lowest mark given was 1. The purpose of this was very much not to come out with an endorsement for any particular party. It was to try and give a sense of what was there, where the parties were stronger and weaker in different policy areas. There's a really detailed breakdown on this that you can look at. Interestingly enough, most of the marks given out were actually half marks for synergy rather than actually meeting demands head on. Some areas were really very strong. I mean, there is across the board in the parties a strong commitment to social care in one way or another. I mean, some of the parties are more specific than others. On the other hand, for some areas like, say, intergenerational activities, virtually none of the parties had anything to say on this whatsoever. The purpose here was not to try and assess how good the individual commitments were. It was to say whether or not the parties were even seeking to address that in the first place. So it's whether they have an action plan to begin with. A lot of the assessment will necessarily be subjective as well. People may disagree with that, but that's why the report does actually, in the finer print, actually demonstrates some of the extracts of manifestos to do that. It's worth saying that the parties have very different priorities, of course, and so that does show through in how this is there. So a lot of it comes down to choice of language and what the parties choose to put up front. And there is inherently, I think, just in the way this is assessed, going to be a bit of a bias towards the larger parties. And I'll tell you why that is. It's to do with the length of manifestos. If you look at the smaller party, generally speaking, and it's much a reflection of policy-making apparatus that's available to them, they tend to have shorter manifestos, say 30 to 50 pages. The larger parties, certainly the Conservatives, Labour, the Lib Dems, tend to have about 150-page manifestos. In addition to that, they tend to also have a Scottish and a Welsh manifesto that's about 80 pages on top of that. So that's a lot more detail in terms of commitment. So if you're picking up, and often this is really quite slim pickings, a half paragraph specifically about elder abuse, there's far more scope for that in larger parties. So you shouldn't be that surprised that the larger parties tend to, let's say, be in the upper half of the marks that are offered here, although there's quite an even spread of marks across this overall. It was certainly an interesting exercise. I was a little surprised at who did better and who did worse in some of this, and you'll see that reflected in the findings. But we've tried to be fair, and we've tried to be as transparent and open as possible, and hopefully you'll see that in the final results.
Okay, that's great, Seth. Thank you. So that's a really useful conversation just to frame our Q&A session now. So I'm going to start, Seth. You mentioned that there was some good synergy around the whole issue of social care. So I have 2 questions around that. The first one is, for the last 40 years, successive governments have failed to grasp the nettle in terms of funding and structure of social care. So what do we believe are the prospects of this getting resolved in the next Parliament?
Two things on that. One is that, you're absolutely right that this has been a long-term problem, that a lot of the manifesto commitments are actually quite vague. A lot of them are just simply, social care is important. We think there should be more money for social care. Nothing more is said. And I think looming large over this actually is the experience of the Conservatives as the governing party going into the 2017 general election, when there was a genuine attempt, however effective or misguided, you'll take your pick, to say we're going to come up with a policy here which is going to tackle the nettle on this and is going to come up with a series of costly proposals that are viable, which proved electorally disastrous. And I think a lot of parties are cautious of precisely that reason because of how difficult and how unpalatable proper investment in social care is for any party. As a result, there are manifestos, I think 2 or 3 in particular stood out in terms of costings on social care, but that is a minority. And so I would say, by all means, look, and this is reflected in the markings, half a mark versus 1 mark, who is actually much more specific about a full plan on social care, as opposed to who has a paragraph that talks about it.
Richard, do you want to come in there?
Well, I was only going to mention really that, and again, talking from a politically grey perspective, it's worth pointing out what non-political manifestos talk about during this period of time. And clearly we haven't focused on them, but there was Women's Aid produced a manifesto recently which talks about the cost to the public purse of domestic abuse. And this is a really interesting point as to why I find it really difficult to understand why domestic abuse full stop is not referenced as widely as it should be. So Women's Aid talk about there being the cost of domestic abuse in England alone was just under 78 billion in 2022. And that among the suite of solutions that they suggest, amongst others, and there's some other really good work across the sector, that an adequate provision of specialist support services would cost 427 million, which could save the public purse as much as 23 billion a year. So therefore, there is a real political priority, or should be a political priority, in looking at how specialist services like Hourglass can find solutions to save the public purse money. And it seems like a missed opportunity across many of those manifestos, with only one political party and not one of the big political parties even mentioning the abuse of older people within their manifesto. So therefore, to follow what Women's Aid manifesto says, if you invest £427 million per year as a minimum to fund specialist services, and of course Women's Aid are talking about women-led buy and force services, you might then begin to look at how that can save lives, change lives for the better, but also look at saving money for the public purse. And nearly 1 in 5 crimes recorded by the police are domestic abuse related, and there are such significant issues with the growth in the epidemic of domestic abuse and abuse and neglect of older people that you'd think there would be more of a priority placed on that. So I think there is a good opportunity for us looking at these manifestos to try to reflect on not just how far the cause of trying to help people understand this cause of the abuse of older people has got, for example, in the last 30 years of Hourglass's existence, but also as we plan towards a safer aging society by 2025, what landmarks are we looking at? And clearly one of the landmarks we want to see is by the time we get to the next election, whether that's a general election or whether it's one of the elections for the 3 other nations within the UK, that we begin to see a much louder voice screaming out around the need of a safer aging society and to end the abuse of older people, in the same way as you hear this rather vague promise. And take, for example, the SDLP in Northern Ireland have said, just in one sentence, ending violence against women and girls. Robust hate crime legislation is mentioned in that particular manifesto. There's talk about a UK-wide strategy in the Green Party's manifesto, and the Lib Dems talk about ensuring survivors of violence against women and girls are properly supported by the criminal justice process. But what does that mean? And how do we look at broadening that to ensure that older victims of abuse, whether they're men and women, are supported equally and there's parity across the board?
And I think it's important just to say at that point as well that is one of the calls within the Hourglass manifesto, that we want to see the existing legal protections strengthened, but also to enforce robust laws that specifically focus on those who abuse, exploit and neglect older people, because we know that we have seen time and time and time again that while there are still too few cases ever of abuse of older people ever prosecuted, those that are result generally in fairly lenient sentences. So with the one case I talk about regularly, a niece stole in the region of £12,000 from her aunt. It was a clear case of economic abuse. And she was prosecuted, but she was given a 6-month suspended sentence and ordered to pay £500 victim compensation. So that is not justice for that victim, but nor is that a deterrent for anyone else. And I think that's why we are very clear in Hourglass that we need to see dedicated task forces or units within the criminal justice sector to deal specifically with the issue of abuse of older people. And I suppose, interestingly, some of the manifestos have picked up and they have referenced domestic abuse workers in 999 call centres. And I think that's to be welcomed. So we are starting to see some progress if these come to pass. Nick, what is one thing that an incoming government in Westminster could do within the first 100 days of office to help older victim survivors?
I mean, there's a very simple one. We have been calling for the government, the current government, to support specialist older people, independent domestic violence advisors and independent sexual violence advisors. There is currently funding provided by the Ministry of Justice to police crime commissioners to provide these in England and Wales. That funding ends in March, and we've got people employed who we don't know what's going to happen after March. And there's other areas where there's no dedicated funding after that, so it's very hard to have any plans. A government needs to make a decision about that in the first 50 days, if you ask me. But then there also needs to be, along with confirming there will be the funding for specialist support, they need to actually make good on what the current government and the opposition in Parliament have said that they will do, which is earmark funding specifically for older people. That's not in manifestos, but it has been said when they were debating the Victims and Prisoners Bill. So that's a very practical thing that would make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And Richard, do you want to just maybe take that point on further? What's the implication of that funding not being provided come the 1st of April next year?
It's catastrophic. I think if this had been in any other sector of society, it would be seen as a vital instrument to ensure against loss of life. We, as a charity, and it's very easy to navel gaze in these situations. We didn't set up this webinar just to talk about what kind of effect a new government would have on Hourglass, but we have members of staff across the south of England, in the east of England, and in London, and in fact over in Wales, but with a different funding source, that are totally reliant on those funds from the PCCs, Police and Crime Commissioners. They're totally reliant on that funding coming from the MOJ, the Ministry of Justice, and we are likewise our helpline, which is the only 24/7 helpline for the abuse of older people in the UK, is also reliant on funding from the Home Office. At this moment in time, there is no clear understanding of what's happening, and it would be catastrophic for the lives of so many older people. But it doesn't just end there. It's worth saying that this funding from the PCCs and the MOJ isn't just about the abuse of older people. It's for IDFAs and ISFAs across all forms of abuse. So we're talking about specialist IDFAs in the LGBTQ plus community, for those who work with the immigrant migrant population, and likewise the same with those from a Black and ethnic minority community. So it would be carnage if this money was not replaced. That said, to continue what Nick said about what one of the things we would need from the first 100 days. Now, it'd be really easy for me to say, as chief exec of a charity that focuses on the abuse of older people, that we require a strategy ending violence against older people. That would be a really easy thing to say. But we also understand that that's not going to happen in the first 100 days of a new government. But what we do need during this period of time is an understanding how backbone organisations can be funded. And it's a word that seems to have fallen out of favour, not just in Westminster, but also in the other devolved nations. Backbone charities who support a very distinct form of population used to receive funding to enable them to save and change lives. Hourglass works with a huge population of older victim survivors, and yet we are forever grasping at small funding sources to look to continue our work. And I think it's high time that no matter what political party is in government come the end of this week, that somebody stood up and took this seriously. And it shouldn't be down to us having to battle with the entire political spectrum to try to find tidbits of funding for us to continue to exist. It's, if anything, there's a lack of parity, and it's a damning indictment of where we are as a society now.
Thank you. I think really you've probably answered a question we have in the chat, which is what would our top 3 priorities be if we receive an immediate injection of funding from the next government? So I think we've touched on all of those. Of course, I am going to add to that. We would expand our policy team because we have so much work to do. And we have so many opportunities, I believe, now to work with a new government and to work with all parties, really, to make sure that we can be that voice and that champion for this issue. Richard, you mentioned the word carnage there a moment ago, and it just reminded me of a question we've had in. During the COVID pandemic, older people in the care sector and their families were treated terribly. Do the parties in their manifestos show any signs of having learned lessons from that period of time? So, Seth, I'll maybe come to you first.
Yes, actually, one of the themes we looked at was lessons learned from the pandemic. Almost every party referenced the pandemic, and about 3/4 of them talked in some way or another. You know, I wasn't holding this to the exact phrase, but the theme of lessons learned. Sometimes it was quite a narrow definition. Sometimes it certainly wasn't in anything around social care, but sometimes it was very far-ranging indeed, and actually a continuous thread on that.
And did anyone, Nick, maybe you can answer this one. Did any party in particular stand out for you in terms of positives or negatives?
Oh, in terms of for me,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go. Okay. In terms of positives or negatives, I think in terms of our policy area, I think the fact that the Democratic Unionist Party specifically mentioned elder abuse, although we would say abuse of older people, but the fact that they've specifically mentioned it as something that's a real plus. I think the first question on social care, I think the Liberal Democrats, at least on paper, have put down some fairly concrete proposals there. I mean, look, both the main parties in Westminster, Labour and Conservative, have got some fairly robust things more broadly about domestic abuse, about domestic violence and violence against women and girls, which obviously we've talked about. I think, we can be positive generally that there's a broader understanding of that, but I think, yeah, the negative, if we're going to, I don't like to end on a negative, but I think the negative would be, given what with the debates we've had in Parliament and some of the meetings we had, it would have been nice to see us a few more specifics in the manifestos. And I do understand perhaps why parties either in government or wanting to be in government might be a bit careful about what they put in manifestos, particularly if they're worried about budgets. But I feel like certainly things like strategy, just, the DUP mentioning older people, other parties could have mentioned older people. An older people strategy doesn't in of itself need to cost a lot of money. to make it work, it will. But I feel like there could be a commitment in principle, and that kind of links back to the Oath campaign. We want a safer aging society, free of abuse by 2050. You can start that process now. You don't have to bankrupt the country right day one and put billions into it, but you do need to make some concrete steps and look at where you're heading. So yeah.
I just chip in also on the point about violence against women and girls. 10 of the 14 parties actually explicitly commit to a strategy on that. In fact, the only determinants amongst the 4 parties that don't mention it is they have the shortest manifestos. They're usually some of the smaller parties. So it very much is an area of political consensus, but none of them actually explicitly refer to age being a key part of that in a strategy. And it's very interesting how little commitment there is in some areas, like, for example, continued advocacy groups. The only party actually that came out and really explicitly said we need advocacy groups in this area and others is Plaid Cymru. But aside from that, there's very little said on that front. And in fact, there was one party which explicitly said we don't like things like advocacy groups. We think it's a waste of taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that. I saw that. There's also it's really interesting as well that I don't know if anybody's looked at there is a specific website where you can put in what areas of interest you have as an individual. I think it's called policies4you.org, where you can type in particular policy framework areas. And there are 2 parties that don't reference the violence against women and girls even in their manifesto at all, and there is one party that would end police and crime commissioners. They've mentioned that there'll be no police and crime commissioners, and they would put that money back into local authorities. So therefore there is a big battle for if you've got parties that don't even mention violence against women and girls, there is quite a journey to take these organisations on, take these parties on, if we want them to understand the needs of a strategy for violence against older people. So I think we as an organisation are really disappointed by that lack of focus. Really disappointed. However, we have to say that our own campaign, the Oath campaign, has also been quite helpful to us in the respect that that's opened up another thread of engagement. And as things stand, we should take our hats off to Sinn Féin and to the Green Party, who have both signed the oath or endorsed the oath in its entirety. And the amount of Green Party candidates and influencers who have signed the oath individually before they endorsed it as an organisation was also huge. It's also worth saying from an oath perspective that the vast majority of political candidates who have signed were independents. So that gives you an idea of the constraints that are put on political candidates in what they can sign and what they can't sign. So we've had a number of emails from Reform candidates who have told us they're not allowed to sign any kind of pledge whatsoever. And there are 1 or 2 who are not Reform candidates who have just made the decision not to, because it doesn't feel right to sign any kind of pledge. Some have come back to us with their own experiences of abuse in older age. And I am encouraged by the fact that there are representatives of Reform who have signed anyway, who have signed oath. So it shows that there's traction there, that there's understanding there. But I think particular kudos is due to the Greens and to Sinn Féin, who have chosen to endorse that. And to, of course, the DUP, who you'd think should endorse it, bearing in mind that they referenced abuse of older people in their manifesto.
And just on that point, and I'll just throw the question out to the 3 of you. Obviously, we have been doing this analysis across the 4 nations. So what are the significant differences across the parties across the 4 nations? Well, we've heard already the DUP obviously has made that quite significant comment around abuse of older people. what are the other differences, or are there any significant similarities?
I mean, I can start talking Scotland, where I think it's an interesting picture. We've really struggled to engage with the government in Scotland, partly because I think they've been a bit busy with some of their own issues, but also in terms of manifesto, the SNP didn't really have much to say. We've done a bit of work with Jackie Baillie, generally supportive. Labour's manifesto up there didn't say a great deal, frankly, nor did the Conservative or Lib Dem parties. At a local level, though, last week we got an in principle motion of support from Edinburgh Council, and it was an SNP councillor who put that forward. So I feel like there's almost a sort of weird disconnect in Scottish politics, where actually at a local level we are starting to get somewhere, but it's not necessarily reflected in the parties or the manifestos yet. Northern Ireland, obviously, we had the struggle with Stormont not sitting for 2 years, but it's come back. I think the fact that we've got Sinn Féin endorsing, we've had a number of DUPs sign, and actually, I think we've had candidates from all the Northern Ireland parties sign oath. So that, I mean, that's positive, and I think there is a sort of growing awareness there. Wales actually reduced what they called a blueprint, not quite a strategy, earlier in the year. Although again, a bit light on detail, and in some ways they're a bit constrained because a lot of the sort of justice and police issues are still run by Westminster, so they're not really in a position, but they still can do things, in terms of awareness raising. Plaid Cymru, as I say, there have been some interesting commitments, and again, there's been some engagement. I think in England, there's interesting debates. So I believe it was the Lib Dems who wanted to scrap the police crime commissioners and give the money to local authorities. It's not on Labour's manifesto, but that has been raised in the past as well. And again, I think the point is, I don't think we wouldn't have a view one way or another whether it's commissioned by police crime commissioners or local authorities. What we would say is the specific resourcing for older people's services needs to happen, and any change needs to make sure that current funding provisions continue and that new funding can be possible under a new arrangement. And I think also is actually service provision is more important than worrying about that type of structure at this point. I mean, I think in terms of the government, I mean, we have to acknowledge there's been one party in power for 14 years. And I think there's been a mixed bag in terms of what we've achieved. And I think some of the legislation, particularly the Victims of Prisoners Bill, did have some good stuff. But I'd say again on the, and I've said this in previous webinars, I'll say it again, when we had the Domestic Abuse Now Act, the Domestic Abuse Bill was debated in the House of Commons in 2020. Not a single MP from any party mentioned older people once. And I think that is an absolute shame. That is a shame on the House of Commons. And I think we need to keep reminding them that that's the fact, that when they should have, no one stood up and said anything. In later debates on other legislation, it has been mentioned, but I think that's been a problem. So I think we've still got a long way to go. Yeah.
Yes, Richard.
So I'm not going to go down the road of looking at the different nation by nation. I can only agree with everything Nick has just said. I should add that Plaid Cymru also want to end the police and crime commissioners as well, and put the money back into the Justice Secretary's hands, Justice Minister's hands in the Senate. And there's also a very interesting information in terms of what the Green Party want to do, which is a really weird sort of disconnect, because they want to localize specialist services but want to do a UK-wide strategy. So there's a really, I thought that was a really interesting approach, but how do you get that right? How do you localize whilst calling for a UK-wide strategy? And I think it'd be worth pointing out the work that the policy unit did in Hourglass around the nation by nation and English regional safer aging indexes, which provides a good deal of information about regions and nations and what lessons we can learn from there. But one of the points I wanted to make was also about champions, because one of the things that the Hourglass struggles with is looking at where that champion is going to come from. And one of the things I was personally looking for in the manifestos was around a commissioner for older people in Scotland and in England, and also some kind of forward commitment for commissioner for older people where that already exists for the future. Now, one thing I did pick up on was Plaid Cymru are very keen to have a victims commissioner in Wales, which I think probably makes sense based on the work that takes place in Westminster. And I know there's a victims commissioner in Northern Ireland as well. But it's a question of where those champions are going to come from, where other nations outside the UK have an older person's minister, how there's much more focus on the rights of older people. Look at in Australia, for example, in America, there's a much bigger focus on the rights of older people. And as much as I may regret saying this, it's also worth saying that the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales, we have a separate little study going on at the moment to look at their approach to older people. And we have the first draft of that report here. And there is precious little mention of the abuse of older people, even in the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's report, annual report. And there is absolutely no representation for older people in her advisory board. So if we can't get a champion within the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's role, and there is no minister or commissioner for older people referenced in these reports, it does appear that there's a slightly steeper hill to climb for us for violence against women and girls, violence against older people to be referenced more tangibly.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. And it's just making me think about the fact that Northern Ireland doesn't even have legislation that protects older people. We're still waiting to see implementation of the Adult Protection Bill. So, and until we have that, there is really a vacuum in Northern Ireland where we're relying on policy that has been described as weak. So that there's a huge issue there. So from nothing in Northern Ireland then, and Nick, you've already talked about the issues around the Domestic Abuse Act in Westminster. If we look at Scotland, one of Hourglass calls to the Scottish Government is to broaden the scope of the definition of domestic abuse. So Nick, do you want to just touch on that briefly?
So, and I mean, I think historically that was that the definition of domestic abuse was intimate partner. And more recently, the Domestic Abuse Act in Westminster, that broadened it out to be a close family member or broader definitions, because most of the abuse cases we deal with actually involve children or grandchildren or close associates of the older person, not necessarily intimate partner. In Scotland, they've still got the old definition. So I forget the exact figure, but the majority of cases that are reported to us in Scotland fall outside the current Act definition in Scotland. So that needs to be changed fairly quickly. And given other parts of the UK and internationally, that definition is changing because that's been recognised. They just need to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we just move on, I'm just checking a couple of questions here. Has there been any specific mention of tackling economic abuse or targeted scams against older people in the party manifestos? Yes.
So the DUP, when they talk about elder abuse, that was the specific mention of what they call financial abuse. So we would say economic abuse, but yeah, that was very much specifically that. You can see that is the focus. Were the other manifestos mentioned economic abuse specifically?
I'm just trying to remember. I'm looking through my notes. It certainly rings a bell, but I don't think it was developed as much as in the DUP manifesto. That was quite a reasonable chunk of it.
And that's certainly to be welcomed, given that financial or economic abuse is the bulk of the calls and cases that Hourglass deal with.
I will. I mean, as a sort of aside, the fraud task force that was set up by the government in Westminster, we've been invited to sort of partake in that, and there may be some pilot schemes that we're involved in. So, I mean, that's more at the ministry level rather than party level, but there are things going on that we're involved with. But yeah, in terms of, I don't recall specific things about the fraud task force and older people, for example, in any of the party manifestos. In fact, I know there wasn't any. I was looking for it.
There's definitely something in Labour manifesto about a fraud strategy.
Yeah, the Labour manifesto is quite interesting in they voiced this landmark mission to halve violence against women and girls within a decade, and advocating for 13,000 additional neighbourhood police and community PCSOs, as well as specialist domestic abuse advisors in 999 control rooms at peak times. So I think that's quite an interesting commitment that they put within their manifesto. But going back to the point, I think I cannot remember seeing any direct reference to economic or financial abuse of any type, although I think you're right, Seth, there was a mention about fraud within the Labour Party manifesto.
Yeah, there was a paragraph on that. I do wonder if it's worth, just for our listeners at this stage, maybe actually going through what the scores and rankings are for the parties, because I thought it was quite important when we started this to not just make it a sort of endorsement thing, but actually now that we've had a bit more of a substantive chat, it may be worth just running through how that goes.
Yes, please.
Sorry, just bring up the right screen. Sorry, I've run between the different.
It's worth saying, I guess, at this point that this document will be available on the Hourglass website tomorrow morning. And we'll also send a copy out to our mailing list. So if you're not on our mailing list, then drop us an email and we'll add you. I think I've probably filled enough, Seth, now.
Okay, yes, no, to put you out of your misery. The party which scored the highest was the Liberal Democrats on 11. Two parties came joint second, who were both the Green Party and the Labour Party, with 7.5. In fourth place, you have Plaid Cymru with 6.5. In fifth place, you have the Conservative Party with 5.5. In sixth place, you have the Democratic Unionist Party with 5. In seventh place, you have the Social Democratic and Labour Party with 4.5. In eighth place, you have the Ulster Unionists with 3.5. There are three parties in joint ninth place, who are the Alba Party, the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, and the Traditional Unionist Voice, all of them with 2 points. There are two parties in joint 12th place, who are Reform UK and Sinn Féin, on 1.5 points each. And last place, in 14th position, is the Scottish National Party with 1 point.
And just to reiterate that point that I made to start off with, this in no way is any kind of endorsement or the opposite to any of these political parties. It's worth saying that we believe that our role as an organisation, as a charity, to work with across the political spectrum to ensure there's an understanding of what work needs to be done to end the abuse of older people, and specifically, by signing the oath, we want political parties to commit to a safer aging society by 2025. By 2050. 2025 might be a stretch. So there's a big. This really just underlines what's in the manifestos, and of course, it's down to the individuals where to put their crosses on Thursday this week.
Yeah, and these are aggregates. So as you'll see from the breakdowns, all of the parties are stronger in some areas, significantly weaker in others. And I'm afraid the sad news, as per a lot of our discussion, is that it's weakness rather than strength characterises a lot of this, because none of the parties gets more than less than a third of the available points on this.
That's a really interesting piece of analysis. So yes, look forward to seeing the final report tomorrow morning. Thank you, Seth. I'm just going to check that we have dealt with all of the questions that have come through. I think everything has been referenced. that I can see here. So in closing this afternoon's webinar, we'll just do a round robin for your final thoughts and comments. So Nick, I'll start with yourself.
Sure. So I think this has been an important exercise in terms of I guess, the state of where people are at. And I think in terms of that final point about some of the low scores, I think one party, they had quite a low score, but they've endorsed oath. So I think it's a journey, and for us, it's about raising that awareness. And I think it's certainly this is not an exercise and this is who you should vote for on Thursday. It's about, look, I think everybody needs to do better, and we want to work with parties and work with government to do that, whoever the government is in all the nations of the UK. So that's, I think, really where we got to, and I think it's been important that we've done this assessment, and it'd be good to measure that up, in a few years' time and see where we've got to.
Absolutely, thank you, Nick. Seth, any final thoughts from yourself?
I think there's a strong sense reading the manifestos that for the vast majority of them, they are not hostile to this list of demands. However, it is not high on their list of priorities compared to other things, other groups of voters, other groups of policy areas that they're looking at. And I think the main challenge for Hourglass is to raise the profile of this in the coming Parliament.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Richard, your final thoughts?
I think one thing that comes across is the lack of innovation in the manifestos. And that's not just around the abuse of older people. It's around women and girls, and and in the broader area of social care, domestic abuse. We really want to work hand in hand across the political spectrum to look at that innovation. Now, there are some signs, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, it's worth saying, there are some signs of hope. Plaid Cymru wants to create a national register of domestic abusers against women. I mean, it's not for us to determine whether that's a good or bad idea, but there's an idea. The Tories, the Conservative Party, want to introduce a mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. It doesn't take much to take that a step forward, take that step further and look at other areas. The Tories also talk about criminalising domestic abuse. So now we, as a charity, for many, many years, talked about creating a crime of elder abuse. Now, we've moved away from that stance because we believe there are a range of steps that we need to take elsewhere. But the notion of criminalising domestic abuse within the Conservative manifesto is really interesting. So innovation is possible. Within the Liberal Democrat manifesto, there's an area around letting victims obtain court transcripts, which is another sign of innovation. Establishing women's justice boards within prisons. And of course, Plaid Cymru have talked about scrapping police and crime commissioners and delegating their role to the Welsh Justice Minister. So what would happen if the Labour Party and Lib Dems and others look at scrapping PCCs, and what would that mean? Would that money go to mayors? Would it go back to local authorities? So I think innovation and creating a pathway towards solutions is really big for us as a charity. And you can read our own manifesto on the website and look at the pledges that we want people to make within the oath. But I think it's really important that what we learn from this is the reason why we talk about 2050. The amount of emails I've had in my email address, some of them from political candidates, some of them from members of the public saying, well, hold on a second. Why are you talking about creating a safer aging society by 2050? That's 25 years. How long did it take us to decide to leave the EU? How long is it going to take us to create a carbon-free environment? And it's taken Hourglass 30 years to get conversations with single politicians around the abuse of older people. So we're all on a journey. And I think if we can ensure that as part of the process that comes from this election scrutiny from these manifestos, that we can hold political parties' feet closer to the fire to get an understanding of where they want to be in 5 years' time or by 2050, then perhaps we can work together across the domestic abuse sector to make a difference.
Great, thank you. So just as we end this afternoon, again, just a reminder, the link for the Hourglass Manifesto is in the chat. The link to sign up to Oath, and we would encourage all of you to sign up and show your support. That's in the chat as well. We'll get you, there's also a link to sign up to receive our newsletters, and that oh, actually, I've just seen a really interesting point come through. Thanks to all. Interesting, but the time is now not 2050. And Richard, you were going to say something there?
Well, I think I've just made that point. The individual who has just made that comment. We want to create a safer aging society within the next 12 months. It's not us that wants to advocate for to wait until 2050. We just don't believe the political machinery and the political apparatus will move quick enough to enable us to do that. However, if that poster or others want to work with us to speed up the process, we are all ears. We'd be delighted to have you on board and to give us a rationale and notions that we can build to create that safer aging society within the next 5 years. We would be desperate to do so, because some of the calls we receive as a charity are absolutely heartbreaking. And to see the effect that has on the families, and not to speak of just our people who work on our helplines, there is no way we'd advocate to create a safer aging society by 2050 if we thought we could do it in 5 years, 2 years, whatever. But thank you very much for the comment, and likewise thank you to others who have made comments on the chat function.
Great. Well, last thing for me to say then is to thank you all. Thank you all for attending, for your questions, your contributions. Seth, thank you very much for your run through of our analysis report. Nick and Richard, thank you for your time. Take care.